Our video today is going to be on circles, its parts, figuring out the circumference, and figuring out the area of a circle. So a circle is a round object. It's a two-dimensional object, so it's flat. We measure it in degrees, so the total degrees in a circle is 360 degrees to measure. Some of the parts of a circle, we start with the easiest one, and that's the center. So it's labeled as a number or a letter, and it's always in the middle of the object. A radius is referred to as from the center to the outer part of the circle. So it's half of the full circle, so AB, as you go, and that is referred to as the radius. Diameter goes from one side of the circle to another, but it goes through the center of the circle. So if it doesn't, that's something that we'll define later. But this case, it's AB. That's your diameter that goes through the center of it, and it must go through the center of the circle. A chord goes from one point or one side of the circle to another. It does not have to go through the center, but it can, and if it does, then we call it a diameter. So we can have multiple chords in a circle as long as it goes from one side of the circle to the other. Again, it does not have to go through the center, but if it does, we call it a diameter, to be more specific. An arc is simply a part of the circle. So it's this section, or we could say this section. You could also say this is an arc all the way around the other direction of the red line. So it's just a part of the outside of the circle. We have what's called a central angle. So we've defined angles in the past, so now we can put them in regard to circles. And it's a central angle because it comes in contact with the center of the circle and it creates an angle. So again, you can have an obtuse angle, you can have an acute, you can have a right, you could have a straight, which would be a diameter or a chord in that case, but it would have to be a diameter dealing with a central angle. So you can start labeling it as that, and we label it the same way as we labeled an angle, so BAC or CAB or simply just A. Circumference of a circle is similar to perimeter of a square or rectangle. It's just simply the distance around an object. So in this case, we're dealing with a circle. So if you think of part of the word circumference comes from the word circle, those two kind of match up together for that. So when figuring circumference, they're going to do two different things for you. They're either going to give you the diameter, which again is all the way across through the center of the circle, or they're going to give you the radius, which is half of that. So we have to make sure that you know what you're given because there are specific formulas that you can use for each of these in figuring out the circumference of a circle. So in this diagram, it shows you that if we're given the diameter of the circle and we're finding circumference, this is the formula that you want to use. If we're given radius, which is half the circle, and one of these could be given as a part of it, then we would use this formula here. So diameter C equals pi d, radius C equals 2 pi r, because the radius is half the distance of the diameter, so we would multiply it by 2 to get that diameter measurement. So the symbol that you're going to use in circles and all the time that you do work with circles and figuring area and circumference is you're going to use what we call pi. And that's how it's spelled, is just pi, and it's a number that we use as a part of this. This is what we call an irrational number because it never ends, it never repeats, but the most that we'll use is just simply 3.14. Later on, you might use the equivalent fraction of 22/7, but again, they'll tell you that in the directions as you go. But for the most part, we're going to be using 3.14 as our answer. So we're technically not getting an exact answer because we are rounding, so we're going to get an approximate number that we're going to work with. But it's good enough for what we're dealing with in these types of problems. So in this case, if we are given radius and we're asked to find circumference. Again, we have two formulas that we would use, and in this case we would take C equals 2 pi r to find our circumference. If we're given diameter and we're asked to find circumference, we can use a shorter one, and that would be simply pi times d. So solving problems with this, one thing that you need to make sure that you do is you start off with the formula. So again, we're finding circumference. They're giving us the radius. So our formula that we would use would be C equals 2 pi r. And we're going to work down the paper as we go, filling in what we know. So we know this is 2. We know pi is 3.14. And we're given our radius as 8 inches. So we're simply going to multiply all the way across, left to right, which gives us an answer of 50.24, and our units for this are inches. And it's just singular, just like perimeter is. That way we only have we don't have any powers in this problem. So if we're given diameter, we would use a different formula, and that would be C equals pi times d. So again, we'd have 3.14, and our diameter in this case is 7 meters. So we'd multiply those two together, and we would simply come up with 29.8 meters. For area, we have a different formula, and the area formula for a circle is always pi r squared, and we always have to use radius. So if you notice, they give us the diameter in this problem. So in order to figure out our radius, we would simply take our diameter and divide it by 2. So in this case, we have 9 divided by 2, which gives us 4.5 yards, and that now is our radius that we're going to use for this problem. So we're going to start again with our formula, pi r squared. We're going to put in 3.14. We're going to put in 4.5 yards, and we're going to square that. So what that ends up looking like is this. When we square something, it's the same number times itself. Get rid of some of this over here. Sorry about that. So we have 2 of the yards squared, because we're going to square it as a part of the problem. So when we do all the multiplication, we're going to come up with, you're going to get some bigger numbers here, so you got to be careful with your decimals. 63.585 yards squared. Now, they may have you round it. That's up to what you see in the answers, so be careful of that. Or they may tell you right off the bat in the answers or in the problem to round it. So the biggest step is making sure that you multiply the radius times itself, and because we get yards squared is because we have 2 of them right here. So for this one, if we're finding area again, and this time we're already given radius, which is always a pleasant thing to get, because then you have one less step to do in the problem. We're going to take our formula, pi r squared. We're going to take 11 feet and square it. So we end up with 3.14. Remember, it's 11 times 11, and feet times feet. So we get 121 feet squared. We're going to multiply that by 3.14, and we're going to end up with 379.94 feet squared. So some pretty basic math in this regards, but just making sure that you start with the formula and work through it and work it down the page as you go. So some keys to being specific with this and being successful with these is always make sure that you start with your formula. Put the numbers in for the formula for the correct letters. Make sure that you label for your units. So make sure that it is correctly labeled. If they don't use any meters or feet or yards, what they're going to do is they're just going to use the word units. Circumference again has no powers. Area is squared, so it would be meters squared yards squared. That way you know that you're finding area compared to circumference. So make sure that you're using your notes, make sure you're showing your work through these problems, but other than that, I don't think you'll have too much of an issue with this section.